Hello, everyone, and welcome into a DawgNation Kroger Commitment Special. We have massive news here on a Friday afternoon for you. I'm sure a lot of you guys trying to get down to Texas ready for it, but we've got some massive news here. Georgia lands five-star defensive lineman Elijah Griffin just committed here just moments ago. You can read Jeff Sentell's story up on DawgNation right now, detailing all the twists and turns that this recruitment has undergone. And Jeff, I'll throw it right to you here. Simply put, this is a massive recruiting win for Georgia. He is the top-ranked player in the state of Georgia. He's the number one defensive lineman in the 2025 recruiting class. What is Georgia getting in Elijah Griffin?
Yeah, Connor. Hey, man, I guess this is a big one. I guess we could call it the Dogs are about to they're about to head to Texas. May already be in Texas, and this is a Texas-sized commitment. And really, this for me is a very intriguing one. Georgia, this was a recruit Georgia absolutely had to win, and they'd invested like they had to win. And I think that's going to take a lot. It starts with Elijah Griffin getting offered in September of his 8th grade year. And that began a 4 years plus relationship with Trey Scott recruiting him for Georgia. I've always felt like he was Georgia was the team to beat here for Elijah Griffin. You can rattle off all of this stuff, man. It sounds pretty to say. Number one player in the state, number one defensive lineman in the country. The first time Georgia will sign the number one defensive tackle since going all the way back to Trenton Thompson almost a decade ago out of Westover in Albany. And you see a lot, 6'5" ish, 6'4.5", 285. He's a top 10 prospect. Georgia has, I guess we could say, signed players of this magnitude, but they're the very best. I mean, Jalen Carter was rated this highly. Michael Williams a couple of years ago was rated this highly. The main thing I see, Connor, is those are greats, and those are greats that their eligibility is either gone or dwindling, or it will expire this season. Well, you got Elijah here. You've got a guy that it sets up Georgia's defensive front, especially first down, second down, for years to come. And he's going to be an early enrollee, I believe. And I think this is a guy that Georgia absolutely had to win this recruitment. They beat out Miami and USC. And I believe this is a new era recruit where Georgia has to go back on that 4.5 years of relationships and visits and goodwill. But I also know, let's be honest, Connor, this is we're not breaking any rules about the Easter Bunny or Santa Claus here. This is one that I think Georgia's NIL game also had to be on par to win this recruitment as well.
Yeah, absolutely right, Jeff. You look at the schools that Georgia were finalists with, USC and Miami. Those are not exactly programs that have been shy about how they use NIL in terms of factoring into those recruitments. And so that Georgia is able to go out and win for a player like this at a position like this, I think speaks to the fact that Georgia is still able to go out there and get it done, what they're able to do with Trey Scott, and, rely on both old age and new age recruiting where, yes, they have the years of experience with the defensive line in terms of turning out first-round picks, really good players, developing guys of all body types. And Elijah Griffin is certainly a unique player in that regard. But it also shows that, look, we've talked a lot about Georgia's NIL usage in recruiting and maybe some of the ways they have and haven't been able to use it. This is an example of something that they want to make sure that goes to on the defensive line. You hear Kirby Smart talk about it so often. Winning in the trenches is so important in the SEC. And so landing a guy like Griffin only further establishes that. And you look at this defensive line haul that Georgia is trying to piece together. I know Isaiah Gibson, a little bit of an edge, might play outside linebacker. I think maybe similar to what Michael Williams does in terms of the way they're going to be able to move him around. But you land Griffin, you add to this defensive line haul, and I think we're now in a point where, last year I think the talent was down a little bit on Georgia's defensive line, and then this year, unfortunately, they've just been so injured, it's been hard to see them getting guys onto the field. But you add Griffin to this class, you've already got Isaiah Gibson, you've got Joseph Jonah-Ajonye in last year's recruiting class. They are getting and stacking the big horses on the defensive line every single year now. And it seems forever ago now, going back to 2019, Trayvon Walker and how seismic landing a five-star in-state defensive lineman was for Kirby Smart and what that signaled. And now we're in a place where it seems like every year Georgia is able to go out and land a player of Griffin's caliber.
And I mean, I got two points here on Griffin. One, slow your roll a little bit, DawgNation, because he's not Jalen Carter. I've seen him a bunch of times, although he does have 15 sacks a year. He's not a guy that's going to flash like Jalen Carter, even though his ranking might even be more impressive. He's a guy that's going to command a lot of doubles. He's going to penetrate. He's going to be the first Elijah Griffin, if I can say that, at Georgia. He's going to have a lot of expectations. Connor, when we saw him last week for the Mississippi State game for his official visit, you saw his size and street clothes, really barrel-chested, really massive, and his frame already stacks up nicely compared to Georgia's guys on the line right now. And this is probably something that I think now that he's committed and in the fold, it sets up Georgia trying to do the ultimate Georgia this year. That's something that we always try to point out: perspective, historical trends. Georgia's never signed the nation's number 1 and number 2 defensive tackles in a class. I don't think anybody, Connor, according to my research, has ever done that in the modern recruiting era, especially on the 24/7 Sports Composite, because that's one that goes back 20 years. And that's substantial. It would be 2 in-state guys. But the other thing that we want to talk about here with Griffin just a little bit is this young man. We've learned that players that have a substantial Y tend to turn out very well at Georgia. They tend to exceed when things get hard, the grind, the bloody Tuesdays happen. They tend to weather it, and they tend to grow and they prosper. Elijah Griffin has a very strong Y. His mother was carrying him in high school. She was pregnant with him. She's went through a lot. He lost core family members right around the time that Georgia offered him. He's got a tattoo on his arm that signifies that 8th grade offer. And he tells me he'll never forget when Georgia offered him, because number one, it really, in a time of deep sadness for him, Connor, it really opened his eyes about there's a future ahead of him. There's a very bright future ahead of him. And I think that's something with Elijah I'll always remember. Sure, everybody's going to focus on he's the new number 1 rated guy in the class, the highest rated guy in the class. He's commitment number 23. We could call him the Jordan commitment if we wanted to. But you're getting a substantial guy that Georgia has poured a lot of resources in. And what Georgia now tries to do is try to add, you mentioned him earlier, Connor, Isaiah Gibson. I said 2 defensive tackles that were 5 stars. This would be a 3 5-star defensive line. So for those of you that want to imagine a Death Star without a thermal exhaust port, I think Georgia's trying to build that right now with 3 ultimate 5 stars, number 1 in the nation at their position across the defensive front when they badly need a re-up right there.
Right. And I think you touch on Elijah Griffin's why and why that's so important to him and his story. And I think that explains why he would fit so well in that Georgia program, the sort of culture that Georgia looks for in these prospects in terms of off-field intangibles. And so you add that in to this recruiting class. They've now got 3 5-star commitments, and all of them are in the front 7. You've got Zayden Walker out of Schley County down there. You've got Griffin now out of Savannah Christian, and you've got Isaiah Gibson out of the Warner Robins area. It all sort of lined up for Georgia this year in terms of the recruiting class, in terms of the 2025 cycle of in-state prospects, who all sort of fit like what Georgia wants to do, but it's easier said than done to go out there and actually land those guys. And so the fact that right now that they have Griffin in class, they have Walker in class, and they've got Gibson in class as well, I think speaks to Georgia just going out there and doing what they absolutely need to do. But with the way that NIL has changed things, that's easier said than done at this point. And so you've already sort of maybe opened up the envelope here a little bit in terms of what's next for Georgia on the recruiting class. I'm sure there are a lot of other names that want to go out there, but I think the biggest one that this maybe impacts or at least draws more interest to is Justice Terry, 5-star commit from Manchester, Georgia. Or he's not a commit anymore. He was a one-time Georgia commit, then he was a USC commit. He is currently uncommitted here. And I think he is now the guy that, now that you have Griffin, for most programs, that would be enough to land a player of Griffin's caliber. But Georgia isn't like most programs, and there is some pressure now for Georgia to go out there, now that they've landed Griffin, to also add Justice Terry to this mix as well.
Yeah, those guys have always been tandem recruits. I can remember a time when Justice Terry was a steadfast commitment to the Dogs, and he was saying, my mission is to get Elijah to come play with me because there's no scheme that allows for doubling both of those guys in the middle. I mean, again, Connor, the one thing about this Elijah Griffin thing that just stupefies people, and it should, they offered him in September 15th of 2020. Stetson quarterback at Georgia, won any natties, and that's the same way they recruited Terry. Those guys flashed really early, 8th, 9th grade. Georgia was the first school through the door, really recruiting those guys really extensively. And, hey, you mentioned Terry. Let's kind of tie things in here. Justice Terry will be at Texas this weekend on his official visit with the Longhorns. And hopefully the Dogs were going to give him that horns down look right there. I think Justice Terry has seen the Georgia Bulldogs now this fall, counting a couple of visits, counting all these visits in Texas and Mercedes-Benz Stadium. He's almost seen the Dogs as much as some of the beat writers, man. So Georgia's definitely trying to give them a good look in terms of what they can offer him.
Right. And so, look, we talk about this Georgia recruiting class. I believe they are now 4th right now in terms of where they rank in terms of the signing class. And if you're adding Griffin, if you're landing Justice Terry, who we expect to take his commitment all the way up to the national signing period or the early signing period, which is now December 4th, mind you, before the SEC championship game, before the transfer portal opens up. Georgia's best available class always had Justice Terry in it, and it had Elijah Griffin in it. And now Georgia, that they have Griffin in it. It's another big win for Trey Scott. It's another big win for this defensive line, which they're going to lose some guys off of that defensive line this year and sort of spinning this into a team angle aspect. You know, Micah Williams expected to be a top draft pick. I think Nas Stackhouse is going to be a day 2 guy. Warren Brinson likely to hear his name called as well. We'll see what happens with Kristen Miller as the year develops. He's dealing with a little bit of a knee injury right now, which is limiting his availability in practice and having some impact on how much he's able to go out and play in the game there. But they've signed now a couple of strong defensive line classes in a row to where Griffin's not going to have to come in and play right away. And you've heard Kirby Smart talk so much about the difficulties of getting guys ready to play on those lines of scrimmages just because of the physicality difference between the SEC and even Georgia high school football there. So I know that there's a lot of excitement. There's going to be a lot of wondering about what Griffin might be able to do right away. And you've already sort of touched on this. He's not going to be, I think, a third down type player where he's just getting in there and rushing the quarterback. But what he can do is be a guy that, because of his run strength, because of his lower body strength, can come in and help out on those first and second downs to keep guys fresh and be an important rotation piece early on.
Yeah, the other thing, Connor, the way he's playing, and it's due because Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins has been playing his hind parts off all season long. He's finally healthy, and that's another name I think that's trending hard to the Sunday League as well. And that's why I think a guy like Griffin is so important. And I think, you know, this is one of those lightning rod commitments, Connor, when we don't really have those anymore. I think like the last time a 5-star committed, even across the country, was back in late August, and that was a 5-star receiver. So this is a seismic lightning rod recruit. I think even the 24/7 Sports team composite rankings, Griffin's now addition to Georgia's class jumps the Dogs over Auburn and LSU into number 3. So you got to keep up with the Joneses in the SEC, and Georgia just does it differently, Connor. They're prioritizing lines of scrimmage. They're prioritizing these guys that can change the game and make things, those havoc makers that make things easier for their linebackers. And I think that's kind of one of the things that this young football team is struggling with right now is the guys up front. Yeah, they can maybe get pressure with 4, but like they're having a hard time covering the back end, so those guys are having to cover a lot longer, and that complementary football from all 3 levels of the defense could be better. And I mean, I think it's up to the standard of a lot of schools in the SEC, the top schools in the SEC. It's just not Georgia 2021, 2022. And I think, Connor, the exciting part of this is when you mesh what Georgia signed at linebacker in 2024 and defensive backs in 2024, and then you add really strong classes back-to-back in 2024 and 2025 across the defensive front, you're really going to have all the ammunition and pieces for one of those, the architect-type prototypes for another really fantastic Georgia defense.
Right, where everything comes together, because so much of what made that 2021 defense special, yes, you had Trayvon Walker, Jordan Davis, Devontae Wyatt, Jalen Carter, all first-round picks, but for a large part of that year, what made that defense so good, it wasn't that those guys on the defensive front were getting sacks, getting tackles for loss, but they were occupying so many bodies that it allowed the talented linebackers behind Georgia to go out there and make plays. Nakobe Dean did that and won a Buckus Award. Quay Walker did it and ended up becoming a first-round pick. And so, look, Georgia's linebacker play, in my opinion, has not been up to standard so far this year, certainly in terms of pass coverage. And look, they're asking a lot of C.J. Allen and Braylon Wilson, who are young players at that position. But I think with where Georgia is set up now moving forward, with the players that they have at linebacker, with the players they have on the defensive line, you're taking steps to get closer to where those two things sort of mesh together once again. Look, the 2021 defense, especially the farther we get away from it, only becomes more special when you realize like Georgia's just not going to be able to keep up and play to that level every single year. But adding a player like Elijah Griffin, surrounding him with guys like Justin Williams, Chris Cole, who's already playing an important role for Georgia here in his freshman year, I think makes it easy. And actually, like, I think Chris Cole is maybe a perfect player to mention in relation to Elijah Griffin, because obviously they're very different players. You know, Cole right now a third down linebacker, but he was a guy came in more probably raw than I would say Griffin is, but found a role, carved it out for himself, and now because of injuries has been asked to step up and help this Georgia team. And, you know, look, we've seen already with this season the toll that Georgia playing the way that they do has on defensive linemen. This Texas game might be the first time all year that they have their full complement of defensive linemen, much less them all actually being somewhat healthy. And so you see that the way Georgia practices, the way that Georgia plays, there is a path here for Elijah Griffin to come in and play right away. KJ Bolden, as a true freshman, has started or has played a ton for Georgia. He's not necessarily starting, but he is a key factor on this defense. And for as talented as this Georgia team is, they've got enough around them to where you're going to be able to find a role if you take care of business. And Elijah Griffin is a type of player who takes care of his business. And that's why I think you feel good about what he might be able to bring to Georgia immediately.
Connor, I think that's the perfect kind of mic drop right there. Georgia definitely took care of business right here with adding Elijah Griffin, the 5-star. I mean, this is one that you go live and you tell all the people, tell all the DawgNation folks about it. Even those that don't get too excited about recruiting anymore, I think they still get excited about the number one player in the state, the number one defensive lineman in the country, especially when that's coming to a Kirby Smart defense.
Yep. So we'll wrap up here. Final thoughts, Jeff. Elijah Griffith, this is a guy you've known for a long time. You've chronicled his recruitment. Final thoughts, final statements, maybe what Georgia is getting in Griffin or what this recruitment means for the University of Georgia.
Yeah, you know, this is going to sound greedy, but I think what it does, and Dog fans will like this close, is it really puts Georgia front and center for his teammate, LaDainian Guyton, the number one overall player in 2027. I've looked at those two young men as Elijah was kind of like the trial run for LaDainian's recruitment. He was going to pattern and model a lot of his walk after the things he learned and he's picked up from Elijah. Now Elijah going to Georgia, will be at Georgia. And if Elijah flourishes, flaps his wings and flies, you know, early 2025, maybe 2026, I think that bodes very well for Georgia to go and get the next great one. Another one out of Savannah Christian at that, LaDainian Guyton, 5-star edge that could keep adding to the arsenal for Glenn Schumann and Kirby Smart's defense.
Yep, so Jeff sums it up perfectly there. This is a win for Georgia today. It could be a bigger win for Georgia in the future, not just on the field, but in the recruiting world as well. There, Trey Scott, another, pelt on the wall, so to speak. I don't know that there's a defensive line coach out there right now that is meshing both recruiting and developing defensive linemen better than anyone. And I think that's a big reason why Georgia's able to go out and land a player like Griffin, why Georgia's able to beat out USC, Miami, two of the wealthier programs in college football, certainly when it comes to NIL. And this is a seismic win for Georgia. So even as Jeff mentions, it might be a shoulder shrug kind of moment. With the way that recruiting is nowadays, for Georgia to go out there and land a guy like this, there are so few true defensive linemen out there. It's a big win for Trey Scott. It's a big win for Kirby Smart. And it just gives a continuation of what Georgia has been doing. And while, at the moment, vibes might not be great, more often than not, Georgia prioritizing the trenches has led them to championships. And I know that Kirby Smart feels that Elijah Griffin is a player that can lead them to championships moving forward. So he's Jeff Sentell. My name is Connor Riley. This has been a Kroger Commitment Special, breaking down the big news, a 5-star commitment for Georgia. Georgia lands the number one player in the state, the number one defensive lineman in Elijah Griffin. We're going to have a ton of coverage for you up on the website, along with more coverage from this weekend from Texas, where not just the DawgNation crew, but Justice Terry will be on attendance as well. They're officially visiting Texas. And Jeff is going to have you way more covered with Before the Hedges next Wednesday. So for Connor Riley and Jeff Sentell, this has been a Kroger Commitment Special. Bulldogs land 5-star defensive lineman Elijah Griffin.